Welcome. So you've sent over some really fascinating material on the Opium Wars.
Yes, it's quite a story.
It really is. Essentially, it's about how Britain's massive demand for Chinese goods, like tea, ended up with them forcing opium into China. And that kicked off some major devastating wars.
It's a striking thing, isn't it? You have Britain, positioning itself as this beacon of progress, civilization,
Right.
and yet it wages war over essentially drug trafficking. It makes you ask, how did we get there?
Exactly. And that's our deep dive today. We're digging into the how. What were the key moments? What actually happened?
And what does it all tell us about empire, its methods, and its long-term effects?
Yeah. We've got articles, research notes, your own analysis here.
Let's
Let's try and piece it together, starting with this trade thing. Late 18th century Britain is crazy for Chinese stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Tea, silk, porcelain, incredibly popular. Huge demand back in Britain.
Can't get enough tea.
Yeah.
But this created that Britain's China problem you mentioned in the notes. Britain didn't really have much that China wanted back.
Not in sufficient quantities, no. China was, well, largely self-sufficient. They produced most of what they needed. Plus, their cultural tastes didn't really align with a lot of British manufactured goods at the time. And you had trade rules limiting access.
So the result was Britain just kept paying in silver.
Exactly. A constant outflow of silver, which, from Britain's perspective, was a serious economic drain, or a real worry.
Okay, so they're looking at this trade deficit, this silver drain, and they land on opium.
Opium, yes.
Yeah.
Grown mostly in British India, it became their answer, their commodity to balance the books.
And they started smuggling it into China in large amounts.
Very large amounts. And this is crucial. Like your sources point out, China had laws against the opium trade. It was banned.
So this wasn't just finding a product China might want. This was actively breaking Chinese law to sell it.
Precisely. It wasn't subtle. It was large-scale smuggling undermining Chinese regulations.
And the impact inside China.
Yeah.
Devastating, I gather.
Oh, profoundly so. Widespread addiction took hold. It wasn't just one social class. It spread through many levels of society.
What did that actually do to society?
Well, think about it. It destabilized communities. Productivity dropped, families were ruined, government officials became addicted. It corroded the social fabric.
A genuine crisis.
A massive crisis. The Qing government saw the danger, the scale of the problem.
Which leads us to Lin Zexu, a key figure.
Yes. Imperial Commissioner Lin Zexu. He was sent to Canton with a clear mission: stop the opium trade. Full stop.
And he took some pretty drastic action in 1839, didn't he?
Yeah.
Your notes are quite vivid here.
He did. He was serious. He blockaded the foreign merchants and their compounds in Canton.
Right.
And then the big move, he confiscated their opium, all of it, and destroyed it. We're talking over 1,000 tons of raw opium, burned, mixed with lime and salt, washed out to sea.
Wow. That's a statement.
A huge statement. A direct challenge to British trade, British profits, and an assertion of Chinese law on Chinese soil.
And Britain's reaction wasn't exactly a diplomatic negotiation.
No. Lin's actions were framed as an insult, an attack on British property and dignity. It became the casus belli, the justification for war.
The First Opium War, 1839. And it sounds like it was a very unequal fight from the start.
Very much so. Britain's naval power was just leagues ahead. Steam-powered gunboats, modern cannons.
Yeah, the tech gap.
Exactly. They can sail up rivers, bombard coastal cities with relative impunity. China's traditional forces, they simply couldn't compete effectively against that kind of technology.
So the outcome was sort of inevitable.
In military terms, yes, largely. China fought bravely in many instances, but the technological disparity was too great. They were defeated, forced to sue for peace.
Which brings us to the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This sounds like a really critical moment, a turning point.
Absolutely pivotal, and deeply unequal, as many historians emphasize.
What were the main terms? What did China have to agree to?
Several major concessions. First, ceding Hong Kong Island to Britain permanently, or so it seemed then.
Hong Kong.
Second, paying a huge indemnity reparations to Britain, covering the cost of the destroyed opium and the war itself.
So pay for the drugs you destroyed and the war we started because you destroyed them.
Essentially, yes. Third, opening up 5 Chinese ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, to British trade and residents.
Opening the floodgates, basically. More access for trade, including opium, presumably.
It certainly facilitated it, yes. But there was another key element: extraterritoriality.
What's that?
It meant that British citizens in those treaty ports were subject to British law, tried by British courts, not Chinese law.
Even on Chinese soil.
Even on Chinese soil, a major infringement on Chinese sovereignty.
Wow. Okay. And you mentioned this term, the century of humiliation. Your sources bring this up. The Treaty of Nanking is seen as the start of that.
Yes, for many in China looking back, this treaty marks the beginning of that period, roughly mid-19th to mid-20th century.
What does it signify?
It signifies an era where China felt increasingly powerless, subjected to foreign interventions, unequal treaties, territorial losses, a sense of national vulnerability and, well, humiliation at the hands of foreign powers. This treaty set a precedent.
And the First Opium War didn't actually settle things for Britain, did it? They wanted more.
Apparently not. Their commercial ambitions weren't fully satisfied. They wanted even greater access to the Chinese market, legalization of the opium trade officially, diplomatic representation in Beijing, things like that.
So tensions remained, leading to another war.
The Second Opium War, yeah. Kicked off around 1856. It was, again, based on various pretexts, like the seizure of a ship called the Arrow.
But the underlying issues were still trade and access.
Fundamentally, yes. And this time, Britain wasn't alone. The French joined in.
France got involved too. Why?
They had their own grievances and ambitions, often related to the treatment of missionaries, but also commercial interests. It showed this growing international pressure on China.
And this second war. It included some really brutal acts, didn't it? The Summer Palace.
Oh, yes. The destruction of the Yuanmingwen, the old summer palace, outside Beijing in 1860, a truly infamous event.
What happened exactly?
British and French troops marched on Beijing after negotiations broke down, and as a reprisal for the treatment of some envoys, the British High Commissioner, Lord Elgin, ordered the complete looting and burning of the Summer Palace complex.
Destroyed.
Utterly destroyed. It was this vast, incredible complex of palaces, gardens, lakes, filled with priceless art, historical artifacts, libraries, centuries of Chinese culture wiped out.
That's staggering, the cultural loss.
It was immense, and it was a deliberate act meant to punish and humiliate the king court. It's a brutal message about imperial power and, frankly, arrogance.
It's hard to square that kind of action with the justifications offered back in London. You mentioned they framed it as defending free trade.
That was a common narrative, yes. Protecting the rights of British merchants, ensuring the free flow of goods.
Free trade in opium. Forced on a country using gunboats.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't really sound free, does it?
It really strains the definition, doesn't it? I mean, what kind of freedom is it when one side is using military force to compel the other to accept a harmful, addictive substance against its own laws?
It feels like a rhetorical fig leaf for economic aggression.
It certainly appears that way. It exposed a moral bankruptcy at the heart of the policy, a clear disregard for Chinese sovereignty, Chinese well-being, all in the pursuit of profit and national interests.
The trauma of that for China's national memory, it must be incredibly deep.
Undeniably. The sources you shared really emphasize this lasting impact. It's woven into the historical narrative, this sense of grievance, of exploitation.
And the consequences went beyond just memory, right?
Yeah.
These wars seriously weakened the Qing dynasty itself.
Massively. The defeats, the indemnities, the loss of prestige. It severely undermined the authority and legitimacy of the Qing government.
Making them more vulnerable.
Yes, both to internal dissent, like the huge Taiping Rebellion, which was happening concurrently, and to further demands from other foreign powers.
So it wasn't just Britain anymore.
You know, the Opium Wars kind of pried open the door. Other powers, France, Russia, the U.S., Germany, Japan, saw weakened China and started carving out their own spheres of influence, securing trade privileges, leases, concessions.
China getting carved up, essentially.
That's how it was perceived, yes. Further contributing to that century of humiliation narrative.
And looking ahead into the 20th century, you can draw a line from this period to the revolutions in China, can't you?
Absolutely. The desire to overthrow the weakened Qing dynasty, to resist foreign domination, to restore national strength and pride, these became powerful drivers for the nationalist and communist movements later on. The Opium Wars are foundational to understanding that trajectory.
It's fascinating and quite sobering how these events from the mid-19th century still echo today. You mentioned Sino-British relations.
Yes, the historical context, including the Opium Wars and the status of Hong Kong, certainly continues to be a factor, sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, in the relationship between China and the UK, and perhaps even more broadly in China's view of the West. History casts a long shadow.
So, wrapping up this deep dive, looking at all this material, what's the main takeaway for you? the big picture lesson.
I think it's a stark illustration that empire building, certainly the British Empire in this case, wasn't just about, flags on maps and noble ideals. It often involved ruthless economic exploitation, military force, and the subjugation of other peoples for national gain. The Opium Wars are maybe one of the most blatant, undeniable examples of that. It's the darker side of imperial expansion laid bare.
It really is a deeply complex and uh, frankly, disturbing chapter of history we've unpacked today. It definitely shows a side of the story that's crucial for understanding how we got to where we are now.
Which kind of leaves us with a final thought for everyone listening. How did these legacies, these historical events where power imbalances were exploited, sometimes violently for economic benefit, how do they still shape our world? Think about current international relations, national identities, even trade disputes. How much of today is still influenced by the echoes of events like the Opium Wars?
Something to definitely mull over.
Yeah,
Thanks for digging into this with us.
my pleasure. It's important history to grapple with.